Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight virtually at the Portland Art Museum. I know many hundreds of you are joining us. We've had over 700 people register, and it would be very interesting to see in the chat where you're being in from. So if you want to join us in the chat and just say hello, maybe tell us if you are in Portland or if you're elsewhere, it would be great to welcome you. And I imagine we have folks from pockets that I don't even know about, so welcome. My name is Stephanie Parrish, and I'm the Director of Learning and Community Partnerships at the Portland Art Museum. To begin, I want to open our time together by acknowledging the land on which the Portland Art Museum now stands. The Portland Art Museum recognizes and honors the Indigenous peoples of this region. These include the Willamette Tumwater, the Clackamas, Clathlemet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Motlala Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kaiapua, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who make their homes along the Columbia River. We also want to recognize today that Portland is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here, and we respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. So welcome tonight to our keynote talk related to Queen Nefertari's Egypt, currently on view at the museum through January 16th, 2022. It's been open for a couple weeks. Last week, we had over 6,000 people visit the museum, which is fabulous. And if tonight is any indication, there's a lot of interest in Queen Nefertari. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. And again, my name is Stephanie Parrish. As part of our accessibility efforts, I'm going to provide a visual description of myself. I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown hair with light hazel eyes. I'm wearing clear eyeglasses and a black sweater over a black and white polka-dotted top. And I'm seated in a light-colored room with a window over my right shoulder. And before I sort of jump into tonight's program, I want to just give you some accessibility logistics and also some comments about chat and our Q&A. So we do have automated real-time captioning available on Zoom. We are unfortunately not on Facebook Live right now due to the technical difficulties. That's why we had to start a little bit late. But you can click on the CC Live transcript down at the bottom of your Zoom bar, and the caption box will come up. The captions are great. We love them, but they are not always accurate. And I bet tonight with some of the terms we'll be using, you will probably see some improper spellings. We've tried to correct those, but I've given you warning. We are also joined tonight by our ASL interpreters. They include Tara Troop and Sarika Mehta. Thank you very much for joining us. And if you have any questions about accessibility, please put those in the Q&A and we can try and assist you. So in addition to the captions, I just did my visual description. Dr. Cooney will also give a visual description, and we find these are really important tools for audience members who cannot see the screen, but who are listening. And tonight we will have a Q&A section or Q&A portion toward the end of the program, and we'll be asking Dr. Cooney questions. She says she loves questions. So if you have them, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them. I can't begin without also thanking sponsors to the exhibition and to tonight's program. So Queen Nefertari's Egypt, the exhibition itself, is presented by Jordan Schnitzer and the Harold and Arlene Kerr Schnitzer Foundation, with lead support from the museum's exhibition series. Additional support was provided by the Clark Foundation, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Burpee, the European and American Art Council at the Portland Art Museum, Kathleen and Joe Karcher, and Greg and Kathy Tibbles. Public support for the exhibition is provided by the Regional Arts and Culture Council, the Oregon Arts Commission, and the Oregon Cultural Trust. And I also want to give a real thanks to all of our museum members out there at all levels and our larger community. Your ongoing support, especially during these last 18 months, has meant so much. And it's so wonderful to see you back in the museum, and we welcome you and are happy to see you again. So for tonight's talk in particular, I want to thank the European and American Art Council at the museum, and also the Mary and Osplin Tooze Endowed Visiting Professor of Islamic and Ancient Art at Portland State University. We've all come together to bring Dr. Cooney to Portland virtually. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Kara Cooney. Dr. Cooney is a professor of Egyptian art and architecture and the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Her research in coffin reuse, primarily focusing on the 21st dynasty, is ongoing. Her book, Recycling for Death, will appear in the coming year with American University Press in Cairo. This research investigates the socioeconomic and political turmoil that has plagued the period, ultimately affecting funerary and burial practices in ancient Egypt. The project has taken her around the world for over 10 years to study and document more than 300 coffins in multiple collections, including Cairo, London, Paris, Berlin, and Vatican City. Her latest book, When Women Ruled the World, 6 Queens of Egypt, was published in 2018 by National Geographic Press. Her next book, which looks really, really amazing, is The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. And that will appear this year in 2021. So I will be back after we hear from Professor Cooney. And with that, I will turn it over to Kara. Thanks for being here, Kara.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, American Sign Language. I'm sorry, I'm going to work you hard tonight. I am Kara Cooney. I am a 49-year-old white woman with long, dark hair and glasses perched on top of my head, seated in my home office in Los Angeles, California, surrounded by weird things like a sistrum, which is kind of cool. And I'm seated on a chair that rocks. So if you see me doing this, I'm not falling. It does it on purpose. So welcome. It's wonderful to see 441 of you joining us today. That's extraordinary. And now let's talk about women and power. Women's studies is something that has swept the universities of the past few decades. And any university, you'll see classes on women, goddesses, the past, hearth and home, but I was dissatisfied with all of that. I wanted to do a study and a deep dive on women and power, where they have it, where they don't, why they might have gotten it in certain places, and why they don't have it in others. And it's very different from my work as an Egyptologist in its more serious vein. And that's what you see on screen right now. On screen right now, you see me sitting in front of a 21st dynasty coffin, a coffin that I know to have been reused. And I study ancient economies and the collapses of government and patronage and other parts of society. And it's very time-consuming and painstaking work. So it comes as a relief when I can do some musing and think about some of the bigger questions that we're all facing and think about what is going on in the world today, because one thing that unites the right and the left in this very polarized world is that we all think something bad is coming, or at least many things are changing, and we all feel that. So that's part of what my work is attempting to engage in, and I'm using ancient Egypt to help me do that. You guys can ask me why in the Q&A, because it's a weird and bizarre thing. But the books are there. This is the When Women Ruled the World, and my new book, The Good Kings, is coming out in like a week. I've already gotten a snarky email about it from a colleague, so that's exciting, and we'll see who else I can manage to upset with that book. And so we'll start with an upsetting slide. So this is very much a visual of what the world looks like today in my mind. And for those of you that can't see it, it's a slide filled with white men, middle-aged and older, mostly older, lots of gray hair. and men who are wearing suits and ties and looking very conservative. And there's very few women, and the women that are there are rather hidden. And it's not, it's a clear picture in my mind of the patriarchy, which is not anything about male rule, except that it's ruled by the fathers and systems that follow that rule through a patriarchal or patrilineal succession, so that the money and the military and the politics and everything about a society, the economy, or I already said money, are all in the hands of those fathers. Much of my work is anti-patriarchal, which is not anti-man. Most of the men I know are not interested in living in the system that the patriarchy has created all around us, but instead want to move into a post-patriarchal reality. So we can discuss what that might be in the last chapter of my next book, The Good Kings, is all about what a post-patriarchal reality might be. What would it be if we not only allow half of the world's population to be half of our power base, but also to throw up in the air what it even means to be binary, to be male, female, and to discuss these things in a different way. So we start with women in power in ancient Egypt, because Egypt was an extraordinary place that allowed women into power regularly and systematically, unlike other parts of the ancient world. So in my class at UCLA, Women and Power in the Ancient World, I compare Egypt to Persia, to Mesopotamia, to the Levant, to China, to India. And we look at Greece and Rome, of course, and we look at where women held power and where they didn't. And the only places that allowed women regularized and systematic places of political power were China, and even more than that, Egypt. And so what is it about Egypt that allows such female power? How are we to understand it? And that's what I'm putting before you today. I'm trying to examine these different women through a number of case studies. And we'll look at 5 of these women. I don't have time for all 6 that are in the book. And we'll discuss why these women were able to make it to the top, what it means and what it could mean for us in the future. So first we have to set up why Egypt allowed such a thing. And Egypt is a very unusual and different place. I always start with a map when I'm teaching. And each time I go to a new place, say we're discussing India or Mesopotamia, you start with a map. And starting with the map of Egypt is very, very useful, because you see the wide Saharan desert expanse to the west. You see the mountains and the desert to the east. You see the cataracts, the blockages in the Nile River down to the south. And then to the north, you see the great expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. So Egypt is very much protected from outside invasion, certainly until the Iron Age. Once the Iron Age comes along, and all of these empires know how to move quickly and are fleet of foot, it's easy for them to get into Egypt. And Egypt has after the Iron Age comes along, one could argue that native rule is not something that Egypt has any longer. But throughout the Bronze Age, and most of the time that we'll be discussing in this lecture, Egypt is protected. So you don't have people coming in from the outside imposing different languages, imposing different systems. It's very much in its own petri dish. So there's not much competition coming from the outside. And then if you look at the Nile River cutting through this desert expanse and creating the world's most giant oasis on the planet, you see that Egypt is not internally competitive either. You don't have a lot of warlording in Egypt. You have a nice steady stream of water that provides inundation and fresh dirt every season for thick, fat, juicy grains of wheat that are going to create nice loaves of bread and lots of beer. So everyone is pretty fat and happy in Egypt, and you don't have a lot of internal warlording. You're not waiting for the rain to fall. You're not fighting amongst each other. So we have a land that that embraces the status quo. And if you embrace the status quo, you're going to see a kingship that can last, king after king. You're going to see dynasties that can last not just for 50 years, but for hundreds of years, for 300 years, if we include the Ptolemaic dynasty. And if you have this kind of king where, let's say that something happens to the king and he's harmed in some way, And the next heir to the throne is only, let's say, 11 years old, because I have an 11-year-old at home. And let's say they choose this 11-year-old to be the next king, however they do so. Everyone bows down in Egypt and says, "Oh, my Lord, what would you like us to do?" In other parts of the world, say that the king died accidentally in Mesopotamia or in Italy, and they all try to put an 11-year-old on the throne. What's going to happen? Well, in a place that's hyper competitive, inside and out, from without and from within, you're going to get warlords all coming after this 11-year-old, and the kid will be dead within the week. Egypt is different. It allows that kid to live, and it respects that king as a divine king, as something that cannot be taken from the throne, something that is meant to be religiously protected. And you could argue that it's not religion that created this reality. It's the geography and the economy that created this reality. But the religion certainly helps to maintain this reality. Now, let's go back to our 11-year-old kid who's on the throne. I have this 11-year-old kid at my own house who I do not want ruling over my household, let alone the entire land. So the Egyptians need to find a way to have good decision-making in their land, because the 11-year-old is not going to do it. You let the 11-year-old rule the land, I don't even want to think about what horrible mistakes might be made. Now, you've got some choices. You're going to set up the decision maker, somebody who is going to be a regent for the young boy until he grows into his kingship, somebody who's going to be able to make decisions on his behalf. And your choices would be, you could take the brother of the dead king who died unexpectedly, who's probably still alive. And you could ask that brother, "Oh, hey, you could rule, and you could, but you're not king. You're not king, but you're going to tell this kid what to do. And then when he grows up, you're just going to melt back into the shadows and let him have his day." Now, we all know the problems with this, because if you invite that man into power, but you don't give him full power, again, there are chances that this kid is going to be dead within a certain amount of time, or removed from power, or something, because that man, the dead king's brother, will want to take the power for himself. Now, what if you decided instead to let the king's mother, the new 11-year-old king's mother, make the decisions? And she's educated. She knows how to read and write. She's an elite woman who knows how to stare down a bureaucrat and get what she wants. That woman would be better for you, way more risk averse. You don't need her to bear arms and know how to lead an army, because she doesn't really have to defend, because there's not too much internal warlording. You don't have to worry about that. Inviting her in means that she's not going to try to take the power. And I'm not saying that just because she's a female and females are less violent than men. That's a discussion that one could have. We could talk about that later. I mean that the system is set up against her from taking power. Number one, the kid is her own son. It's her own blood. She probably loves him. She probably wants to see him succeed. And given that family bond and the amount of investment she's already put into that 11-year-old, she will want that investment to continue and bear fruit. She's going to be more likely to step back into the shadows after he grows up and grows into his kingship. And then number two, in the ancient world, and Egypt is no exception here, women are not allowed into professions. They're not given a foundation of power economically, militarily. She's not going to have any ability really to take the kingship from him, to wrest power from her son, even if she wanted to, and take it to herself, because she doesn't have the professions available to her to pull an army to her, to get them to do what she wants, to pull priesthood to her. All of these things will be very difficult. So the Egyptians figured out a way, and they did this dozens of times, to have women rule on behalf of kings who were not quite ready to rule. And they used these women regularly as placeholders to link one male aspect of power to another male aspect of power. The issue here, in the dark underbelly of what we're discussing, is that female power then is only allowed in an authoritarian regime. Because I'd like you to compare in your mind what this might be like in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. These places are much more competitive. They are averse to kingship and an authoritarian rule at all. They like to give the power to many different male players. When one man falls, another man takes his place. There is not much opportunity for a female in either of these systems. Egypt, on the other hand, is an authoritarian kingly regime that allows its kingship to continue from generation to generation. And to do so, they will allow a woman into power. So I would like you to sit back and relax and realize that female power had to be imposed upon people in an authoritarian regime. And when they have the choice about whether or not they want it, they don't seem to take it within a patriarchal system. What things might be like in a post-patriarchal world, one can discuss. So about 5 times, 5 to be precise, we could maybe add a 6th, but we'll keep it at 5 for now. These regents, these females who were serving on behalf of a king and making decisions on his behalf, were able to use that power as regent and catapult it into real power and become female king, which is extraordinary. The fact that that happened at all is amazing, and we shouldn't overlook it. It means that young girls can look at school textbooks and realize, yeah, they could rule, I could rule. It can be done. A woman can rule. But we will also see that it's not as happy and full of puppies and rainbows as we would like, that these women are very much used and sometimes abused in these places of power. And in almost every case, but not every, they are removed from the history books, so that historians like me, we have to come in and resurrect them. We have to find them from the places where people have used chisels to rub them out, or statues have been smashed into tiny bits. We have to put these pieces back together. Now, some of you may be wondering why I say female king and I don't use the word queen. And that is because the ancient Egyptians, they used the word queen only for a helpmate or sexual partner of the king. When they talked about the woman as the highest leader of state, they used the word king. And here I'm going to focus in on the hieroglyphs for the word king. And it's there in the central column, and you can see the sedge plant, and then a little bread loaf next to it, and 2 reed leaves. That's the king. And then below that, you have 2 oblong, long shapes. Those are signs for land. So that is the king of the 2 lands. And this is in association with Hatshepsut. And if they're using this to describe Hatshepsut as the leader of state, then I should use it to describe the leader of state. So if the Egyptians use the word king, I am going to use it as well. English is a different matter, of course. Now, let's start with our female kings of ancient Egypt. MERNEITH is not a king. She is a regent and stays as such, but is buried as a king. So I will show you why I include her in this list. One of them we're not going to get to. I don't have time. I'm going to yell Game of Thrones and move along. And we'll see how many details I can get out of these women. There's so much that one could say that I'm going to keep it superficial into the basic patterns that these women share, but try to keep the story flowing as one. So first we hit MERNEITH of Dynasty 1. This is interesting that as soon as kingship comes along in ancient Egypt in 3000 BCE, a strong queenship comes along with it. Because as archaeologists were working at the site of Abydos, Abydos, in Upper Egypt, and they're in the king's necropolis, and they're finding all these king's tomb here, king's tomb there, and they start digging in between, and lo and behold, they find another tomb and a stela, a marker that goes with it. And then they assume, oh, well, clearly we're dealing with another king's tomb here. But then they look at that marker more carefully. And I think you can see this marker. It has the name of the queen. Her name is MERNEITH, the one who's beloved of the goddess Neith. And she's got 2 crossed arrows on her symbolic fetish. They look at that more closely and they compare it to other such stela. And they see, wait a minute, there are 2 very important things missing. This person was not a queen, or sorry, not a king. She was a queen. And they look and there is the hawk is missing. Oh, somebody says we cannot see your pointer. Can you see when I zoom in, when I go like that? Can you see it? Somebody can just say yes or no yes. Okay, so that's all I'm doing. Not using a pointer. I just zoom in because that makes it a little bit easier for me. So if you look at all of these different stela and different things, you can see that there's a Horus bird, a falcon, a hawk at the top of it. And that is missing on MERNEITH. So you can see it here on jets, and you don't see it there on MERNEITH. And you also see something else that's missing, the palace facade. So look at this palace that you see that has the mud brick crenellations. There's all these doorways that go into the mud brick. And note how this mud brick palace facade is missing from the stela of MERNEITH right here. So no hawk, no mud brick facade of the palace. She's not a king. Something else is going on. She is the queen mother, and you can see it here. So this is a king list, and this is a tiny little label about, I don't know, 3 centimeters tall. And it was found in the tomb of the guy next door, of a king called Den. And this will be MERNEITH's son. And it had a little king list in it. And you can see over to the left, there's a Horus bird and then the sign of DJER, and then a Horus bird and the sign of JET. And then you see the hand and the water sign. This is King Den. And then all the way over here, you see at the top right, a vulture and a sedge. That vulture and the sedge plant is the king's mother. And then underneath is MERNEITH, beloved of the goddess Neith. So the Egyptians are giving her credit immediately in the reign after. We have a king, a king, a king, and actually MERNEITH belonged in between 2 of them. She's the queen mother after King Jet and before Den, and she's there ruling on behalf of Den. Now, what did she engage in while she was the queen regent ruling on behalf of her young son Den? Well, this story is almost impossible to piece together, but we can do it. Remember, this is 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. So you try to put this stuff together. Archaeologists and Egyptologists have done their best. This is the main story that they've discovered. It seems that when MERNEITH was young and growing up in the palace, there was a king whose name was DJER, may have been her father. Very long-lived king, very, very powerful, was able to take control of Egypt very ably. When he died, he brought with him almost 600 dead courtiers. Those courtiers were almost certainly strangled or poisoned or in some way dispatched to accompany their king in death. This tomb, and that's from the work of Egyptologist Ellen Morris, shows a preponderance of females. Women are a part of this tomb. He's bringing his wives with them. And each one of these individuals gets a little stela. And on the left, you can see these stela here, and they're marking whether they're male or female with their name on it. And each one of the individuals gets a small room in the tomb. And each of these rooms was capped and roofed at the same time. And that's why Egyptologists think that indeed they were put to death. But they may have almost certainly were willingly put to death. These people had good teeth. They were well bred. They were well fed. He's taking with him courtiers and family members. MERNEITH would have witnessed perhaps the death of her own mother in such a situation. We can't know. The Egyptians don't keep diaries. Authoritarian regimes don't tell you all the details of what happens. We have to piece it together from what we have remaining. But MERNEITH is not included in these sacrifices. She's probably a daughter of the king. She's probably needed to marry the next king. And that next king could very well have been her own brother. This isn't clear. We'll talk more about royal incest in a bit. But King Jet is the next king. She's married to him. She's likely not the only one married to him, but she may be the most important one married to him. And when Jet dies, it's too soon. It doesn't seem like they have everything figured out. The boys that he's been able to bring to this earth are too young. And at his death, they have to do the same burial rites. This is the way in the first dynasty to show the power of kingship. They do it through sacrifice. They do it through blood. Lest you think that the Egyptians are unusual or cruel and strange, please understand that you can look at the practice of sacrificial burial as practiced by human beings. In China, in the New World, North and South America, you could go to the site of Cahokia and see sacrificial burial there for a king. It's usually in Africa, in Europe, it is all over the world. And sacrificial burial is usually done to manufacture power for a new kingship. And by new kingship, I mean when kingship was new in a system, when before they hadn't followed a king. Now everyone's deciding, okay, we're going to go all in with this new system. They need to reify and manufacture that power. And they show that this king has power over life and death. They display that people are willingly coming to their death to be with this king in the afterlife forever. It's an extraordinary thing to do. And MERNEITH was a part of this world, such that when her husband dies before his time, and they choose her son, King Den, to be the next king, and they enthrone him, they probably did the enthroning and the burial rites at the same time. And it was probably MERNEITH who decided who lived or died. She's the one that chooses you are going to your death, and you I will spare. The kid is not the one likely making these decisions. She's the regent. She's the king's mother. She's the one put into the king list. Each one gets a little marker of his and her own. Each one gets a little room of his or her own. I don't want to leave you with the impression that MERNEITH, because she's a woman, was in any way shying away from violent actions. If she needed to take them, she would take them. And in this new kingship that was being created, take them she did. And the patterns are interesting. Ellen Morris, that same Egyptologist I was talking about before, she determined that more males went to their death in this round of sacrifice, which makes perfect sense, right? MERNEITH is trying to decide, how do I keep this kid safe? I'm going to kill all the males who might try to claim the throne. I'm going to get those men or boys out of the way. Many of the sacrificial burials could have been women with young sons. We don't know the details of all of these things. We piece it together from the objects that are left to create a very macabre story. And even the matter of death is not known. And one of my own recent PhD students, Rose Campbell, wrote a dissertation on the causes of death of these First Dynasty sacrificial burial victims. And she was able to go to the Victoria and Albert and I think it's Cambridge, where many of these skulls were retained. They got rid of the bodies. Don't get me started. This is Flinders Petrie and others that were doing these excavations, and they disposed of the skeletons, but they kept the skulls. And the skulls are in Britain, in England. And she went and saw those and saw that many of them do actually have head trauma that may suggest a blow to the head or some other kind of method of dispatch. But Matt Adams, the archaeologist who works on the site and who helped uncover the skeletons you see here much more recently, in the last decade, he argues that they used some kind of a poison, maybe something like cyanide, which was used at Guyana with the Jonestown massacres, can kill very quickly, very efficiently, and it works well for an ideological display, I might add. So this is MERNEITH's reality. Skip this guy. When MERNEITH dies, she dies during the reign of her son, Den, who is now strong, who doesn't need her the way that he did before. And yet he still gives her 120 people who are sacrificed for her burial. This is why I treat her like a king. She's buried like a king. She's listed like a king, even though the Egyptians hadn't quite discovered that they could name her a king. They won't discover that for another 11 dynasties. But buried like a king, she was. This is what her tomb may have looked like according to this reconstruction. And yet we see that in the next dynasty, in the second dynasty, just a few kings, a few generations later on, MERNEITH's name is no longer in the king list. We have the DJER, JET, Den, and then it just goes on from there, from one male occupant to another. She was useful in the moment, but she's not useful to keep in the history books. They want instead, in this authoritarian regime, to keep a perfected and perfect picture of male power. And now we move along to our next woman. It's a woman named NEFERUSOBEK of Dynasty 12. For those of you that follow Egyptian history, we are indeed skipping Nitocris, who only appears in much later texts of the Greco-Roman time period. And if she existed, we would put her at the end of the 6th dynasty, but there's no contemporaneous evidence for her from the 6th dynasty. So we leave her to the realms of mythology and move on to NEFERUSOBEK. Now, NEFERUSOBEK doesn't rule as a king's mother, but rather as a king's sister and a king's daughter. But it's still a connection to the king, right? She's not there as a regent, however. And she's there at the end of a dynasty, not smack dab in the middle of a powerful one. She's there in the middle of one of Egypt's most powerful dynasties. She's part of Dynasty 12. Her grandfather was SENWOSRET III. And if you can see this image, the face shows an angry and sad face simultaneously, a formidable visage to look upon. This man ended up breaking his elites and getting them all to kneel before him at his capital city to the north. And he was also able to control large swaths of the Levant and of Nubia. And he handed the same strength and power onto his son, AMENEMHAT III, who is probably NEFERUSOBEK's father. The next king in our lineup is AMENEMHAT IV. And you can already see from the Sphinx statue that I'm showing you, of much lower quality, the face is abraded, doesn't look very nice. This statue of AMENEMHAT IV gives us an impression that AMENEMHAT IV did not live very long. And the history seems to suggest as much, because we move from the strength of SENWOSRET III, strength of AMENEMHAT III, and then to this king who is very short-lived. Well, it seems that NEFERUSOBEK was married to him. This may have been her own brother. We're not clear on that. But the next king in line will be NEFERUSOBEK. She will actually take the title of nothing less than king. She will not be queen, she will be king. So how does this even happen? How do we have one of the most strong time periods of Egyptian history that all of a sudden moves to a female as the only one left in power? Well, I would invite the idea, though the Egyptians would never tell us this, again, an authoritarian regime is not going to give us their secrets, but I would invite the idea that we're dealing with incest, that the Egyptian stakeholders, the people in power and the crown at the top, they want to keep that power. And inviting a father-in-law or brothers-in-law into the court and having them take positions and money is highly problematic. It's very, very useful instead to just take the incestuous product of a brother-sister pair, a half-brother-sister pair, and to instead have them keep the status quo going. The Egyptians practice incest regularly to keep power, and lest, again, we think that we are more advanced than the primitive ancient Egyptians. Those of us of European descent will know that Cleopatra was Macedonian Greek. Her dynasty practiced incest more than any other Egyptian dynasty, any native Egyptian dynasty. And then if you look to Europe, particularly in the late medieval and Renaissance, you see extraordinary accounts of incest. And I show you here Charles II of the Habsburgs and the portrait that shows him with an extraordinarily large jaw and an oversized head. And this is a very kind portrait of Charles II of the Habsburgs. So with all of this status quo, risk-averse attempt to keep power, it seems that Egypt's helped us invent its first female kingship. And we don't have an image of NEFERUSOBEK with a head attached to it. We only have this body. And this body without a head, this statue shows us, however, that NEFERUSOBEK creatively combined her feminine self, wearing a dress, showing her breasts, with the Nemi's headdress, with the stripes that you can see in your mind's eye when you think of the Tutankhamun golden mask. She's retaining her feminine self, and she's layering the kingship onto her person. She doesn't rule very long, this NEFERUSOBEK, 3-4 years at most. And as with most short-lived female kings, she does not leave any sort of legacy. She doesn't pass anything on to any sons. Doesn't seem she has any sons, because if she did, I guarantee you, he would be king, she would be regent, right? But there are no sons, there's no husband, there's no brother, there's no nothing. So she gets to be Egypt's first female king because of that. And she doesn't seem to bring any lover or a new husband into the court. She leaves Egypt to found a new dynasty. And after her, we see the 13th dynasty being founded. But before that, she's very canny, very clever to make sure that she doesn't try to create a foundation for her kingship based on the dead husband. We people in patriarchal societies do not trust peer-peer connections for female power, but we do trust a patrilineal sort of succession, a vertical succession. And so what I mean by that is, just to give you an example, Think of in the 90s how upset people got when Hillary Clinton was assigned with no real position and no real office to oversee the new healthcare initiative on behalf of Bill Clinton. And people said this is, and on both sides, right? We're like, this is awful. We can't have this. And that's, I would argue, because in a patriarchal system, two people on the equal planes who are peers to one another, it means the female can compete with the male. She can take his power. And there was a great amount of distrust against Hillary Clinton. And there is still a great deal of distrust against Hillary Clinton, probably for that very reason. Now, compared to that, Ivanka Trump or her husband, Jared, and the two of them, both of them, without any official position, without any official power or elected office, were placed into all kinds of positions of power to do all kinds of important things. But at least within the Republican base, this was very much supported because it follows a patriarchal linear structure. They know, the people, the base, the supporters, that Ivanka and Jared can't do anything that Donald doesn't want. And so it works. Well, let's go back 4,000 years and look at NEFERUSOBEK. She does the same. She justifies her kingship and everything that she builds by putting her father's name, AMENEMHAT III's name, next to her own, and saying, I'm just connecting with him. I'm just his next in line. That's all I'm doing. And we don't even know about the husband. He's so not mentioned by her. It's more useful for her to put herself as the eldest daughter in this lineage. So a clever leader, short period of time, and doesn't leave much of a legacy after her. And that's really this case with TAWOSRET as well, but we're not going to be able to talk about her. She's our Game of Thrones. So we're going to move on to HATSHEPSUT of Dynasty 18 next. Now, my first trade book was all about HATSHEPSUT, the woman who would be king. And one could talk for hours and days about HATSHEPSUT. So we'll keep it short and sweet. But HATSHEPSUT was the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, and also the sister of a king, because she married her half-brother. No, I'm not making that incest part up. What she never became was a king's mother. And that's because during the reign of Thutmose II, her half-brother king, she only gave birth to a daughter, Neferure, and did not give birth to a son. If she had given birth to a son, we would speak about her very differently. But instead, she gives birth to just the daughter. So when Thutmose II, her husband, dies after only 3 years on the throne, HATSHEPSUT is in a very, very interesting place because HATSHEPSUT is the highest priestess in all of Egypt. She is known as the god's wife of Amen. She has her seat in ancient Thebes, where she is ruling over an extraordinary temple space of great proportions. She has palaces, she has lands. And when her half-brother husband, Thutmose II, dies, all of the courtiers and the elites and the priests, they look to her because she's been placed there by her father, Thutmose I. She's there as a very, very important member of the royal family. And the last member of the royal family has just died out. They want to know what to do next. Well, they have to choose a child who is not her own. And she is going to act as regent, decision maker for this 2-3-year-old kid who is not her own. This is the thing that's going to invite problems. We discussed at the beginning how if a mother is acting as regent for her own son, in whom she's already invested many hours, in whose future her own future rests, she will support him. She will continue to work with him. I'm sure the mothers of the sons and daughters in this lecture know what I mean, right? But if that kid is one step removed and it's some other woman's child, she's not necessarily going to be as supportive of him. And that does seem to be the case because while she rules for him, she keeps laying out a game plan to become more powerful as she goes along. So she is a good decision maker, according to the people who talk about her. They tell us that she's a very good and able strategist. But then by year 7, and there is Egyptological disagreement about that one, but by year 7 at least, she names herself, or has the god name her king next to Thutmose III, her nephew and co-king. And it's a very strange thing that she gets to be king while there's another king on the throne. And you wonder, Did she think, oh, I need to have this kid removed from power? I want it all to myself. Well, if she thought those things, if she entertained those ideas, this was a clever woman. She would have known that if she had tried to remove him from power, then her own grasp of power would have quickly been gone. And like NEFERUSOBEK before her, she would have ruled for a very short period of time, and then whoop, it would have moved to another dynasty. She's there holding the weight of the dynasty of her family, this THUTMOSID dynasty. Her father was the first in this line. She's seen that her half-brother has already died. She's there holding the weight as the king next. She needs her nephew, Thutmose III, to succeed. So she raises him to be an able and amazing king. While he's growing up, though, because we're talking about a pretty young thing here, 2-3 years old, I suggest in my own research, she's got a long time to rule on her own without too much interference from him. And you can even wonder then, given that there's this 2 or 3 year old on the throne at all, why was she crowned? It can't be just ambition. Nobody gets to work alone. Nobody in this world, not Putin, not Trump, not Biden, nobody gets, as we see in government today, one person has very little power. Even in authoritarian regimes, you need people that are your entourage, that are your backers, people that are going to work with you. And Hatshepsut needed that as well. She can't just go in there and say, okay, I'm going to be king now, and that's it. She needs a base of support. There were probably issues that allowed her to take this power grab. And we can surmise what may have happened. Maybe Thutmose III is, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, and he's got a malarial fever. And they're like, oh dear, he might not live through the week. And they're like, we need to lock this down. We all need to keep our jobs, make her king. And everyone's like, yep, doing it. We're in. Maybe. Or maybe Thutmose III's family, the mother's family, the family from someplace outside of the court, was getting difficult, trying to take power, trying to come into the court, take some of the wealth and some of the resources. And people are getting annoyed. And they're like, we need some pushback. Make her king. Okay, we'll make her king. So there's something going on in the political world behind the scenes that we cannot see. And the Egyptians will not show us this. For instance, the image that I'm showing you now is Isis holding life, the breath of life, up to Hatshepsut, who is kneeling in front of the god Amun-Re, who is putting the royal diadem upon her head. She shows everything in a religious lens. She tells us that she's only doing these things and taking these positions because her god father, Amun-Re, asked her to do this. Otherwise, she would never. She knows, like most women in power today know, that you can't openly talk about your ambition. Instead, you have to downplay it and smile and denigrate yourself a little bit and make light of it. She would have known that as well. So Hatshepsut, all in all, rules for about 22 years. No small thing. And she leaves behind no legacy of her own. Everything is going to go down the lineage of her nephew, Thutmose III. And throughout that entire long reign, she never rules alone. Her footsteps are being haunted by the young king behind her, ever growing more wise, ever growing stronger. And she even depicts herself in many scenes as almost an equal of that boy. So it's an extraordinary thing to behold how similar she is to Thutmose III. But throughout, she does everything right. She is a jobs creator. She has control of the money, and she has money pouring into her regime. She controls the temple. They love her and she loves them. And there's a lot of self-help going on. She sends an expedition to Punt, shows all of the details of this expedition. She builds fabulous structures and temples and is in control of all of those building projects. And yet she can never get this kingship to fit itself to her femininity. She starts out by depicting herself as a female king, much like NEFERUSOBEK had before her, wearing the dress, putting the striped Nemes headdress on, layering the kingship on her person. But this is not satisfactory for whatever reason. And she tries to create a rather androgynous figure where she's a little bit male, a little bit female. She's here in this white limestone image from the Met shown without a shirt, but she has the hint of female breasts. And her whole body is very gracile. Her face, her shoulders are very slender. She looks feminine. And eventually she throws in the towel. And most of her images show her very masculine. She shows herself with big pecs and biceps and shoulders and even a strong jaw, all very masculine. This is the majority of her statues. She decides, okay, fine, I can't beat him, join him. She puts on her shoulder pads and her black pantsuit and her blocky heels, puts her hair back and gets to work. And that's what Hatshepsut does to masculinize her kingship and fit this role. So she does everything traditionally and perfectly, and she is buried in state in the Valley of the Kings by Thutmose III, her nephew. And yet, 20 years later, he has all of her images and names erased. So you can see on this image here, and I'll zoom in, the chisel marks that show that they've removed her names wherever that they could find them, leaving Thutmose III's names intact. And these statues that I have been showing you have been smashed up into bits that Egyptologists have had to glue together, conservators have had to glue together from tiny bits to remake what had been destroyed. So she ruled for a significant amount of time, leaves no legacy, and is erased from the history books for people like me to try to resurrect. Now let's move on to our next two women, and we'll keep these rather short and see how we do. Our next one is Nefertiti, whose story is very much being written in the history books and by archaeologists. And many of you know Nefertiti as this beauty whose bust is in Berlin, this pretty face. And the chapter that I write about her is more than just a pretty face. She's more than just high cheekbones. She found herself in a maelstrom of change, religious change, during the reign of this guy, her husband, Amenhotep IV. So in the 18th dynasty, this king Amenhotep IV, he comes to power during a time of fabulous wealth and excess. And he depicts himself as any other king would depict himself, normal body, normal face. You can see his body and face here in profile. And then boom, he changes his name and he starts to depict himself as a hybrid between male and female. You can see the breasts, you can see, well, you can't see, there's a big belly here and big hips. You'll see it in images to come, and weird spindly arms and clavicles that are all marked, and high cheekbones. He's also a hybrid, one could argue, between animal and human. This new king Akhenaten decides that he's going to change Egyptian religion from the inside out. And as he does so, he changes Nefertiti as well. She will get a new look, she will get a new face, and eventually she will get a new name as he changes all of these religious ways. He actually moves the capital as he's deciding that there is only one God. Actually, let me go back. And that God is the round sun disk in the sky with its rays coming out and terminating on his body. This is the Aten. And he says that there is only the Aten, and we should worship no other gods, and there should be no statues of gods, and you only worship the disk or the globe in the sky. And he builds all of these new temples at a new capital city that he builds from the ground up during his 17-year reign. He probably had only a decade to do it. And he puts no ceilings in these new temples because you only want to see the sun in the sky. That is your only idol. And Nefertiti is along for the ride with all of this extraordinary change that's making the courtiers and the priests go, what? You want to do what? Throughout. And he gives her a new name. And her new name is Nefertiti. Now, bear with me as we go through this. And I know this is on the cheat sheet for people, so that's useful too, because these names are pretty tough. But she's given a new name and a new crown, the crown that we see on her Berlin bust. This is a very fabulous and strange, like semi-triangular, modious crown that is specifically associated with her. And as she's given this new name, she's given a new stature. She is there on par with her husband Akhenaten. She's there on as equal stature, equal size, and we will soon see equal power. And throughout this, we see Akhenaten making sure that his elites do what he wants by paying them off. And we have scenes of this payment very overtly expressed. And here Akhenaten and Nefertiti are throwing golden trinkets down to their elites who will do whatever they want. But throughout all of this success and change and building a new capital city from the ground up, bioarchaeologists have discovered a really dirty underbelly to all of this movement. In fact, they've found graveyards that suggest a work camp or gulag type reality where people were working undernourished, working with broken bodies and in very, very difficult conditions. And you even have child labor of children separated from the adults. This was the price to pay for all of this change. And Nefertiti is a part of it, but she's not Nefertiti anymore. Now it seems she's going to become co-king with Akhenaten. And she has now got a new name, Neferusobeek. So one element is always retained and then the old things, they go away. It is even possible that this Neferusobeek may have been the very person for whom the mask of Tutankhamun was made. Please let me blow your mind a little bit by pointing out this reality, that this mask of Tutankhamun may actually have been made for Nefertiti. This is not my research, but the very careful and able research of Nick Reeves. And you should Google his work on Nefertiti and you'll go down a really fun rabbit hole that you won't be upset about. Now, Akhenaten dies. And when Akhenaten dies after his 17-year reign, the Egyptians seem quite happy to go back to the old ways, the polytheism, the old temples with their deep enclosures and hidden idols and other things. And it's even possible, though if you really want to start a bar fight amongst Egyptologists, bring this up. It's even possible that Nefertiti served as sole king after the death of her husband Akhenaten. She was co-king. You don't remove a co-king from the throne. They stay on. They're king and invested with that power as well. It would make sense that she would continue. And the name suggests it, because the name of the next king is Ankh-Khepru-Re-Smenkhare. And you can see with that Ankh-Khepru-Re element, if she is the sole king after, is taking on a new persona, she's keeping part of the old persona. And if Nefertiti is there as king, then at the end of it all, she helped to clean up the mess that a man made, because she helps to put everything back towards the old orthodoxy and the old religious ways. But her story is so erased and so difficult to understand, her history so overwritten, that we can barely talk about Nefertiti as a king at all. So I told you there would be one image where I would say Game of Thrones, and this is it. TAWOSRET of Dynasty 19, whose story is rip-roaring fun, but we do not have time for it. It's a lecture all on its own. As she was regent for Siptah, a child king on whom she stole power and maybe moved aside, but there's too much, it's too much. And we have to get to Cleopatra and end our discussion so you guys can ask me any questions that you want. So Cleopatra is not Egyptian, or was she? There's disagreement about this. She is the last in a line of Macedonian Ptolemies, all descended from Ptolemy the First. But it is quite possible that her mother was Egyptian, because Cleopatra spoke and read Egyptian. We see this in the Roman texts. And if that is the case, then perhaps we can talk about Cleopatra as an Egyptian female king. In any case, the fact that she's of this Macedonian dynasty and that we see her there at the end, holding on to power at the end, like NEFERUSOBEK, like Nefertiti, it makes perfect sense. And it makes us realize that power and systems of power are as formed by the places in which they find themselves as by the people, if not more. So Cleopatra follows that pattern of Hatshepsut in that she rules for multiple decades and she never rules alone. If a woman rules alone in our story, she rules for 2 to 4 years, and that's it. It goes on to another dynasty. Cleopatra's dynasty will end with her. Indeed, it will. But she's able to rule for such a long period of time because she always keeps a man or a male of some age next to her. And you guys already know this story. You know it so well. You know what I'm going to say. She ruled alongside her father, Ptolemy the 12th. And then when he died, the reign was passed on to Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra as co-kings. Now, they ended up fighting a bit of a war with each other, and he dies in that war. And then the Romans are like, nope, we need you to rule again with another brother. So she rules with Ptolemy the 14th as co-king. Well, this one she just has assassinated. She's like, I'm done with you boys. You're very, very difficult. So she moves him along. But Cleopatra is canny. She knows she cannot rule alone. So she's looking around and realizes that one of Rome's best warlords might be the best person to be her protector. He looks at her and says, wow, this woman's got a lot of cash. That could be useful for me in the civil wars that I am fighting right now. So this, I would argue, is Cleopatra's means of maintaining power. And even when Julius Caesar is removed from power by his own people, she moves on to another Roman warlord. This is an Egypt that's no longer a Bronze Age and protected Egypt. This is an Egypt that is perched on the edge of a Mediterranean world that can't protect itself from all of the empires that are growing and all of the different geopolitical struggles that are happening. Cleopatra needs Mark Antony. He needs her. And the two of them have an excellent union that produces many, many children. And here you'll see. Okay, now look at this family tree where we have from Ptolemy the 12th down to Cleopatra the 7th with her 4 children that she bears with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And I would like to make the argument that Cleopatra is the most masculine in our story. She's almost got a harem, if you like. She uses 2 men, neither of whom she marries, as sperm donors to produce the next generation of rulers who are going to take over her entire regime when she is gone. Now, of course, we know that doesn't happen because we have a series of disastrous campaigns. And we know that it's a really bad idea to have a land war in Asia. But Mark Antony decides, I'm going to be like Alexander the Great, and I'm going to invade Parthia, and it's going to be awesome. Well, it wasn't awesome. It turned out to be a horrific series of disastrous mistakes. He comes back from Central Asia, defeated, emotionally debilitated, comes back to Egypt. And in that state, they try to claim the whole game in one big naval battle, the Battle of Actium, which of course we all know they lose, right? Octavian wins the day. And Cleopatra hightails it back to Egypt. Mark Antony goes back to North Africa. They both are said to commit suicide. I want to mess with that with one. I have 2 more points, and this last point is that Cleopatra doesn't rule alone. She always has a male next to her. The dynasty ends with her. I would encourage you to rethink this suicide narrative because it serves Octavian too well. This suicide that makes her look like a selfish, greedy, fearful drama queen who's going to abandon her entire family lest she be put in any difficult situation, right? That's the story that we have of Cleopatra. That story has been very carefully and ably written by the Romans to get us to think about Cleopatra in that way, which brings me to my final point, which is that for all of these women that I've talked about, these women in power, please note that those that are successful, those women who, like Hatshepsut, were able to build extraordinary regimes, we can't pronounce their names anymore. They're not a part of our cultural memory. Shakespeare didn't write a play about Hatshepsut. He wrote a play about Cleopatra. And that's because failure, especially in women, is something that can be used as a cautionary tale to tell people why women should never rule. Failure is also very idiosyncratic. It involves poison from an asp. It involves a sea battle that you can't escape from. It involves all kinds of little details. Success is what you're supposed to do. Success is creating jobs, building the temple, doing everything same. If you do everything you're supposed to do, how easy is it to remove one name and put another name in its place? It's kind of like, for those of you that have came up with a great idea with your boss and you're like, I have a great idea, and your boss takes it into the meeting and claims credit for it himself, right? Or herself. I've had both happen. So that kind of thing is the moral of our story, that I want you to understand that all of these narratives written about women have been written by men and have been written from a particular agenda. And while I'm not here to rewrite this story to celebrate these women in of themselves, or to write a revisionist history that makes them more powerful than they were, I do want to resurrect the idea that there's a lot of power here and that credit has been taken. And so I will leave you on that note, and you can ask me any questions that you like. And I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time.
Thanks, Kara. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
I'm going to open up the Q&A here because a bunch of questions have come in. And if you do have any questions, additional questions, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat at this point. We've tried to transfer things over. Also, I just want to mention what we will put in the chat is a link to a form. We're actually gathering questions for a podcast that we're going to be recording with Kara in a few weeks. It's called Awkward Questions for Kara Cooney.
And I love awkward questions. That'll be so much fun.
And the idea here is to kind of think about the field of Egyptology, colonialism in museums, the issues around human remains. There are a lot of really sticky kind of big questions that an exhibition like Nefertari presents us with. So we're going to take some time with Kara to talk about some of those things, which maybe they'll come up here in the Q&A too. But if you have an awkward question for Kara Cooney, we're going to put that link in the chat, and maybe we'll fold it into our podcast. And then, make sure you sign up for the museum's e-news, because we will of course put that podcast up online when it's ready. It'll be recorded toward the end of November. So I'm just going to run through these in no particular order. Well, I guess top to bottom here, but talk about light damage. This is like a really basic kind of logistics question. Does light damage the Egyptian objects, the stone objects, the wood objects? What's your kind of thinking there?
Yeah, it does. And it's not something I really specialize in. And I always wonder about this, working on coffins, painted, wood panel painted objects, right? I think it's particularly difficult when the paint is on plaster and the light can actually damage it, or when there's ink of any color that's on a papyrus where it could just, the light can flake it off. So that's as I understand it. But I think that sometimes the light in a museum is lower than it needs to be, and they do it all spooky on purpose, right? To make it seem, woo, Egyptian. But it's not a bad thing, because in a temple, the Egyptians are only going to have lamplight. And so it makes sense that we keep our electric lights at a minimum. So I think I'm okay with it. But yeah, light damage isn't something I know a huge amount about, but I'll just say that I don't ever use flash photography when I'm photographing things. But let me tell you, if they're going to do a catalog in a museum and they need to use flash photography, they're going to do it. And then they'll say, okay, well, this will be one of the times that we do flash photography. But they just want to avoid it in a museum where everyone's flashing all the time, right?
Right.
I think it's a cumulative constancy of light damage where it can be very, very problematic. The biggest light damage is the sun. So, and what do you do about that? Some things need to be taken out of the sun and put into a museum if we're going to preserve it. But when you do that, you lose the context and you lose where it comes from. And it's a problematic thing.
Yep. Well, we welcome photography in the museum, but no flash. That is right. Okay, so here are some longer questions. You spoke of women in power afterward being pushed back into obscurity, having their inscriptions obliterated and altered. But co-regencies and the transition of power were always complex. Even in the famous destruction of HATSHEPSUT'S monuments by Thutmose III, I heard it proposed that could have been as much consolidation of power by the newly ascended ruler as any form of hatred or misogyny. How would you respond to this?
100 times yes, absolutely. You're exactly right. I think that when you're studying the patriarchy, particularly for ancient Egypt, you're not trying to make it a story that we so often write for Greece or Rome or the European world as one of single rulers making decisions about what they want or what they don't want. These are things that work best for the system. And the patriarchy and passing something down from father to son, and then having Hatshepsut step in and then erase her later, is not necessarily smacking of hatred or misogyny, but smacking of her being a difficult element of the story that kind of ruins the beautiful patriarchal divine kingship. She's got to go. So you don't have to make it about hatred. And in my first book, and in both books, When Women Ruled the World and The Woman Who Would Be King, I talk about this very interesting theory that I did not come up with, which is that Thutmose III, when he's handing his kingship down to Amenhotep II, who was a much younger son than he needed to pick, it suggests that he's passing over older sons who may have been related to Hatshepsut's side of the family. And as he does this, he removes her images to, as your question asker said, to consolidate power. That is indeed the case. That means that there's a faction that's connected to Hatshepsut's family, potentially, that's like, why are our guys not in this position? What the hell are you doing? And the people in power, i.e. the king, this is started by Thutmose III and continued by Amenhotep II, are like, oh, really? Watch us, and start chiseling everything up. And when you smash a statue made of red granite, and a lot of these statues are made of those hard stones, this is not an easy and cheap thing. Destruction seems so mindless and easy. You just go and smash it up, and Henry VIII, and you burn things down and you take all their stuff. This isn't that. This is to uncreate a red granite statue. You have to go in with all of the same tools that were needed to create it, because bronze chisels cannot cut granite. So you're going to need all kinds of dolerite pounders and other things to uncreate this. It's very expensive. And all of these things were smashed, starting arguably at the cobra on the brow, and really into tiny bits. I mean, they're doing their best to get this. That's why there's so many holes. They crunch them up so much. And then they shove them all into a hole in the ground in front of her temple. I can almost guarantee you this was done formally. It was done publicly or semi-publicly. It was done for people to see who was in power. So is it a consolidation? Is it a threat? Is it misogyny? I would say it's definitely the first two. The misogyny haunts the entire patriarchal narrative. That's just there. That's just there for funds and, whatever. It's just what's there. The misogyny has to be a part of the patriarchal story in some way, shape, or form because of the way women are commodified for their reproductive abilities. So I'll leave it at that, but you're exactly right. It's much more complex than the simple narrative that I presented here. Yeah.
A few comments have come in about Queen Nefertari and the exhibition, and just really, really general questions because you don't address her specifically. But what are your thoughts on Queen Nefertari, and where does she fit in this narrative or these narratives?
Yeah, Nefertari is interesting. It's so easy to get confused between Nefertari and Nefertiti, so please don't do that. Though I wouldn't hate you if you did. But one is the 18th dynasty and one is the 19th dynasty. So what are you even thinking? But Nefertari is the wife of Ramses II, the great royal wife, the highest ranking wife, and was known as a beauty, and all of the images that present her there as a beauty. But when she comes into power, or when she's named queen, it's during a time period when female power had been largely stripped from the court. And by that, I mean the god's wife of Amen, high priestess position, was really enfeebled by this time and was not a position of great political or economic power. And also, this wasn't a time period when the kings were marrying their sisters. When the kings married their sisters, those sisters had power. They had power, they could wield it, and they were there in the courts as not necessarily equal players, but definitely players. And when those kings didn't marry their sisters, like in the 19th dynasty, then you see that power slip away. And Nefertari is a part of this pushback against female power. Just like, we have today, this has happened and there will be a pushback, right? The Obama presidency created a pushback against diversity candidates in politics, for example, right? So if you make that kind of a claim that there are human pushbacks politically, all of the female power of the 18th dynasty, we've got the 18th dynasty starting out with extraordinary female queen regents who are ruling on behalf of young and unable kings. And all these gods' wives of Amen. Then you get Hatshepsut, who becomes an actual king. And then it ends with Nefertiti becoming a co-king and then a king. It's so much feminine power within a patriarchal system that is destabilized economically and politically by that feminine power, that it is very possible that we're seeing a pushback, and Nefertari is a part of that. She truly is there to be a pretty face, a producer of the next heir, the sexual helpmate of the king, and that's it. Yeah.
So here's a question that maybe relates a little bit. How did Egyptians of the time feel about or relate to the female heads of state? Was there any day-to-day differences in the lives of Egyptians?
There's so little that we can actually say in this authoritarian regime, where people, in Rome, they would write down, oh my God, even after his, reign was over, they'd be like, Nero was a crazy dude and this is how, right? Or at least they gave us some sort of details. Or we might have Cicero in a letter or a speech saying something about a political competitor. So you get an idea of what's going on. That's not Egypt. So you don't have anybody putting anything in writing so that it's preserved for us. You don't have that. The only things we have preserved are ideologically perfected religious texts. Sometimes you might have some economic texts that talk about how somebody was paid or how somebody changed hands. But really the best information that I've got, that people at the time were probably pretty damn happy to have Hatshepsut as king, is that during that co-reign between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, the amount of building and spending by high elites just skyrocketed into craziness. Everyone's got a nice tomb. Everyone's got a nice statue. There are more jobs being created than at any other time. I mentioned that briefly, right? But I didn't talk about what that might have actually meant. It means that Hatshepsut and her entourage, because she's not doing it alone, to keep and maintain her power, is giving out more treasury goods from the king's court than they would have previously, and is unbalancing the system of power between elite and king. And that imbalance is something that the Egyptians will take forward into the coming dynasties. One could argue that the kingship was never strong in the same way it was before in the early 18th dynasty after Hatshepsut, that she weakened the kingship and empowered the elites. It's an interesting discussion. Here's a question about the king lists that were written for centuries or millennia after most of the pharaonic history. If Egypt's women were indeed written out of the history, was it by ancient Egyptians, or was it as much done by later interpretations? Yes and yes. Yes and yes. It's both. But the ancient Egyptians, when you take a chisel to something, you're certainly removing somebody from the history as we have it, right? But keep in mind, and I have my copy right here, that Manetho, this 4th century Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egyptian kings, and we only have it preserved in excerpts in other authors' texts, that he includes Hatshepsut. And her name is wrong, and it's really old history, and he doesn't get it exactly right. But there are two streams of history in Egypt. There's the perfected history of the temple, and then there's another history that's maintained for initiated people who could handle it, that a woman ruled and don't need the perfected story. But then when Hatshepsut was discovered, you can look at things that were written in the 40s, 50s, and 60s about, in 1940s, 50s, and 60s, not to mention the 19th century, that talk about her as this greedy, power-hungry witch of a woman who just needed to have it all for herself, and who took the power from this boy, this poor boy. All of that stuff is there. So yes and yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about the practice of changing names throughout one's life, such as you outlined with Nefertiti?
I will say it's very, very rare, if not aberrant. It's not something that is done. When you become king, you bring your given name with you, and there can be some messing with that given name. I don't think that the 11 Ramses were all named Ramses at birth, for instance, but that is still their given name. So you take your given name, and then you're initiated as king in the temple, in the temples, all the temples of Egypt that would have taken weeks and weeks. And you would have been given a name, invested with a kingly name. Both of those are put into cartouches, and those names stay. They don't change. The only thing that might change in those names are additions like epithets. Like Hatshepsut adds at one point in her reign, Hatshepsut, Henemet, and Amen. She is united with Amen. So she adds that little bit, but she keeps the Hatshepsut. To change a name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, it's the weirdest thing we've ever seen. It is highly unusual. And to change names, like Nefertiti had her name changed, or if she decided to have her name changed herself, we don't really know. It is highly unusual. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like the Amarna period. We call it the Amarna period. That's the name of the modern day site in Egypt, in Upper Egypt. And because there's nothing like this very strange and deviant time period, we need to see it as the aberrance that it is.
So there are a couple questions here about gender and gender fluidity, which are really interesting. Is there any evidence of gender fluidity in any of the Egyptian dynasties?
Yeah, I just did an interview for a Discovery Channel Book of Queer about these things. So keep your eyes out for that. It looks like it's going to be great fun. They wanted to talk about Hatshepsut and put her in the Book of Queer. And I was like, yeah, but that's implying that she wanted to be masculine rather than that masculinity being imposed upon her. And from what I can see in the art history, I don't see her choosing that at the beginning. I see her kind of settling into something that she had to do. Oh, and let me stop sharing my screen so you can all, there, that's better. I'm so sorry, you guys should have done that before. So I don't see Hatshepsut in that way, but I think Akhenaten kind of fits. Akhenaten is choosing purposefully to be male and female simultaneously. And his images, I mean, I could write a whole book just on the body of Akhenaten and what it was that he was trying to communicate with that body. He does have breasts that have they're kind of man boobish, if I may, but they're also rather feminine too. And he's got this big belly that pushes down his belly button. We can all push our belly buttons, you know, it squishes it. And he's got that in the statues. And so he's got the breasts and the belly and massive hips. Men don't have hips and thighs like that. They just don't. And if you look at the imagery, he's saying something that is highly unusual, that he's trying to be like, maybe like the god Hapi, the god of the Nile inundation, who is both male and female at the same time. The Egyptians did understand some divinities to be non-binary, to be queer, if you like. And it seems that Akhenaten is taking on that identity potentially. It's something that no other Egyptian king wanted to have a part of. He was the only one that wanted to do that. And then there's I think a lot of people don't put Akhenaten into the queer category because he had a wife and he had children, and he shows those children. It's a little hard to make more out of it than that. And then people try to take the tomb of two brothers and turn them into two gay lovers. It could be so many other things. There's no definitive proof that that's what this situation was. And then I would encourage everybody listening to read the tale of Horus and Seth. It's a wonderful bawdy ancient Egyptian tale about Horus and Seth fighting for the kingship. Osiris has been killed. Seth has killed him. Seth says the kingship is mine. Horus is the young son. Seth says he's too young. He can't rule. There's no way I should to have the kingship. And to show his power, they have all these feats of strength. They build boats and have a boat contest. Well, there's one part where Seth rapes Horus, and Horus pretends to be raped, but he instead catches the semen in his hand and then tells the gods, well, then he makes Seth eat his own semen by putting it in lettuce. And then when Seth says that he's raped Horus, they ask for the semen to be called forth, and the semen is inside of his own body, and everyone laughs at Seth. So my point is, it's an extraordinary story, but it shows that homosexual sex or pedophiliac sex was considered more of a power move and less of an identity choice. There's very little in this society to make it an identity choice. And I would also point out that the only reason I think that we're moving to a non-binary queer reality and allowing people to express what it is they feel they are and want to be biologically in terms of identity, gender identity, is because we are moving into a post-patriarchal reality, economically and culturally. The ancient Egyptians were not. They were living in a patriarchal agricultural regime. The rest of the ancient world was as well. Herding communities were as well. So it would be very difficult for somebody who felt a queer identity to actually act upon it. And those that could were generally those at the top of society who were enriched by that society and had all of the money and power to throw around as they liked. And those people were able to express a queer identity. But most people, no way, they couldn't. Yeah. Fascinating.
Really, like that's what I guess you could have an entire like class on just that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you 3 more questions. And
yeah, sure.
This one is like maybe a little bit different but I really love it. Your slide showed some birds and fish, but wildlife needs trees. I haven't seen trees in your slideshow nor in the PAM exhibit, except one place I call the Blue Room, where there were palm trees surrounding high-end houses with barren hills in the background with tunnels, maybe for tombs. Were any of the kings of either sex very concerned about renewal of the landscape?
The Egyptians, so the first thing is what I showed you with the trees and fish. That was from Hut, and I raced through those slides because I was running out of time, and I apologize. But those, you can look them up and Google the expedition to Punt, P-U-N-T. And to prove that she had gone there, Hatshepsut, she ordered them to record Red Sea fish. You know, these are the fish that grow not in the Nile and in the freshwater, but in the saltwater. And she ordered them to record the kinds of trees, like the incense trees that you would have gotten in Ethiopia or Eritrea or wherever Punt is. And that's another big discussion. So there was an interest in an encyclopedic reality. In the same way that when Napoleon invaded Egypt and said, "This is now mine," he ordered all of his guys to record the fish, the fauna, the flora, the fauna, and all of the antiquities. And that's the Description de l'Egypte that he produced. So the encyclopedic taxonomy and recording is, I would argue, part of, and I'm sorry to make it all about the patriarchy, but it's part of a patriarchal claim. It's part of people men saying, I have taken this place, all that is there. I have categorized it. I have encyclopedically described it and shown it. It all belongs to me. And I know it. And Hatshepsut is engaging in that as well. She has to. So she goes to this part of the world and she's like, I know the fish, I know the Red Sea, I know the place. And all of those things are given to her as a kind of power. Now, the other part of that question was about living with the environment. The ancient Egyptians really had no choice but to live with their environment. And we could learn a lot from living with that environment, because if you go to Egypt today, you will see that the Nile is a very slow moving body of water without the life that it once had before it was dammed at multiple intervals. And I know in Portland, you guys talk about dams all the time, and you know what it means to dam a place and to take the life out of it, and what it means to undam it and to let it be again. Well, Egypt is now heavily dammed and relying on that hydroelectric power, but the land is over-salinated, it's over-fertilized, it's highly problematic to live in that kind of environment. And I have a grad student, he's a PhD now, Dr. Amr Shahat, who just did isotopic analysis of the Nile water. And I can't talk to about the numbers because I don't understand the science, but the numbers that he saw, they made him sit down and cry, because the Nile isotopic numbers he's like, the Nile is almost dead. And the fact that we're building 2 more dams, one in Ethiopia and one in Sudan, and that those are filling, the Nile will continue to slow down and the life will continue to be sapped from it. And you don't have that movement of earth, all of those things are blocked. It's a blocked artery, a blocked channel. And it's something that the Egyptians talk about a lot, but they talk about it against the Ethiopian and Sudanese dams, not against their own. And it's an interesting thing to watch from afar. It's not my country and not my decision, but I see the havoc that has been wrought by those dams. But then it's nice to have an even water source, right? That doesn't flood and create devastating floods. So, how do we live sustainably with an earth and allow the earth to be geographically as it wants to be? These are all questions that we need to be asking as we move into our new reality that doesn't try to claim and carve into the land.
Absolutely. Okay, two final questions, which I hope are easy questions.
Yeah.
Why are the noses always destroyed?
In my opinion, noses are destroyed just like other things that stick out are destroyed. They're sticking out, you know. It's, if a head falls, the nose is the first thing that's going to go. An ear, a statue can't fall this way as easily. A statue is often going to fall forward. Backs of the heads can often be destroyed. But yeah, I've heard other things for the noses. I don't think that there's any sort of agenda at work here, but I will say, and this is important, that say you go into the temple of Edfu, or the temple of Dendra, and you see a temple that's been reused as a Christian church, you will see the deactivation of imagery. And to deactivate an image, if you believe that there's a devil, that this is a pagan temple of devils, and but you want to use the temple because it's powerful, you will actually deactivate those images. And to do that, you will go after the eyes, the nose where it can breathe, the mouth where it can speak, and the ears where it can hear. And most of the time in a two-dimensional image, that's just smashing the face and you're good to go, right? Sometimes it's more careful chiseling of the eyes. It is also possible that there was that kind of deactivation of a three-dimensional image, that people wanted to take the life force out of those images. And there is still a cultural memory that these images have great power. And of course, the ancient Egyptians, they had opening of the mouth ceremonies that were meant to bring each statue to life. They would do so publicly or semi-publicly. So you set up a statue, and then you go through all of these rituals that wake it up, that make it active. And if you have that cultural memory of that statue having power over you, then you might want to deactivate that power. So my short answer is that either they fell down and it's sticking out, or they want to deactivate its power.
Yeah. Okay. And last question. Is it possible to take your UCLA class online? Or how else might people stay connected to you?
It is possible, but you don't need to, because I did an Audible original called, what is it called? Powerful Women of the Ancient World. So put in Kara Cooney Audible original Powerful Women, and you won't have all of the slides. It's just an Audible with no visuals. But I go through half of my class in that format. And I think that you would get a lot out of that. It is possible to take my class in the summer. It's just a class for credit with a TA, and to pay those TAs, it tends to be expensive, more expensive than most people would like. However, if you do want to take the class in the summer and write a research paper and go through all of that, you can, but only during the summer can non-matriculated, non-UCLA students do it. So just go to the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures website. I would say every summer, probably one or two people who aren't UCLA students do so, take the class for credit and enjoy it. So, you know, if you want to, you can.
Great.
And I do 2 live sessions in that class. So it's not just recorded. I have my lectures recorded, but then I show up and we have a discussion twice the session. So
great. Well, maybe there were some takers out there. Well, so thank you so much. This was fabulous. I know we took almost 2 hours of your time, but you gave us, you're very generous. You gave us a lot. I want to mention that my colleague Hannah Layson is going to do a post talk chat with educators in Portland. If you are a Portland educator and you are interested in talking to Hannah about Dr. Cooney's presentation and also how you might use the exhibition in your classes, please, there's a link, I think, in the chat that you can go to, and Hannah will be there. And then again, we'll be producing a podcast with Dr. Cooney in November. So stay tuned for that. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to Becky Emmert and Jaleesa Johnson and our ASL interpreters. It takes a little village to do this, and it's fabulous to have so many of you join us. So thank you, Dr. Cooney, and we will see you on the podcast.
Thank you. And I see everyone saying thank you in the comments. It's really nice. So thank you all.
And come see the exhibition if you're in Portland.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.